To envelop your enemies, you must use whatever you have in abundance. If you have a large army, use it to create the appearance that your forces are everywhere, an encircling pressure. That is how Toussaint Louverture ended slavery in what today is called Haiti at the end of the 18th century and liberated the island from France. He used his greater numbers to create the feeling among the whites on the island that they were hopelessly engulfed by a hostile force. No minority can withstand such a feeling for long. Remember, the power of envelopment is ultimately psychological. Making the other side feel vulnerable to attack on many sides is as good as enveloping them physically. In the Ismaili Shiite sect during the 11th and 12th centuries AD, a group later known as the Assassins developed a strategy of killing key Islamic leaders who had tried to persecute the sect. Their method was to infiltrate an assassin into the target's inner circle, perhaps even joining his bodyguard. Patient and efficient, the assassins were able, over the years, to instill the fear that they could strike at any time and at any person. No caliph or vizier felt secure. The technique was a masterpiece of economy, for in the end, the assassins actually killed quite a few people. Yet the threat they posed gave the Ismailis great political power. A few well-timed blows to make your enemies feel vulnerable in multiple ways and from multiple directions will do the same thing for you. Often, in fact, less is more here. Too many blows will give you a shape, a personality, something for the other side to respond to and develop a strategy to combat. Instead, seem vaporous. Make your maneuvers impossible to anticipate. Your psychological encirclement will be all the more sinister and complete. The best encirclements are those that prey on the enemy's pre-existing inherent vulnerabilities. Be attentive then to signs of arrogance, rashness, or other psychological weakness. Once Winston Churchill saw the paranoid streak in Adolf Hitler, he worked to create the impression that the Axis might be attacked from anywhere: the Balkans, Italy, Western France. Churchill's resources were meager. He could only hint at these possibilities through deception, but that was enough. A man like Hitler could not bear the thought of being vulnerable from any direction. By 1942, his forces were stretched across vast parts of Europe, and Churchill's ploys made him stretch them even thinner. At one point, a mere feint at the Balkans made him hold back forces from the invasion of Russia, which in the end cost him dearly. Feed the fears of the paranoid, and they will start to imagine attacks you hadn't even thought of. Their overheated brains will do much of the encirclement for you. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal was planning what turned out to be perhaps the most devastating envelopment in history, his victory at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, he heard from his spies that one of the opposing Roman generals, Varro, was a hothead, arrogant and contemptuous. Hannibal was outnumbered 2-1, but he made two strategic decisions that turned this around. First, he lured the Romans onto tight terrain, where their greater number would find it hard to maneuver. Second, he weakened the center of his lines, placing his best troops and cavalry at the line's outer ends. Led by the rash Varro, the Romans charged into the center, which gave way. The Romans pushed farther and farther. Then, just as the Zulus would encircle the British within two horns, the outer ends of the Carthaginian line pushed inward, enclosing the Romans in a tight and fatal embrace. The impetuous, violent, and arrogant are particularly easy to lure into the traps of envelopment strategies. Play weak or dumb, and they will charge ahead without stopping to think where they're going. But any emotional weakness on the opponent's part, or any great desire or unrealized wish, can be made an ingredient of encirclement. That is how the Iranians enveloped the administration of President Ronald Reagan in 1985-86, in what became known as the Iran-Contra affair. America was leading an international embargo on the sale of weapons to Iran. In fighting this boycott, the Iranians saw two American weaknesses. First, Congress had cut off U.S. funding for the war of the Contras against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, a cause dear to the Reagan government. And second, the administration was deeply disturbed about the growing number of Americans held hostage in the Middle East. Playing on these desires, the Iranians were able to lure the Americans into a canny-like trap. They would work for the release of hostages and secretly fund the Contras in exchange for weapons. It seemed too good to resist, but as the Americans entered further into this web of duplicity, backroom deals, secret meetings, they could sense their room to maneuver slowly narrowing. The Iranians were able to ask for more in exchange for less. In the end, they got plenty of weapons, while the Americans got only a handful of hostages and not enough money to make a difference in Nicaragua. Worse, the Iranians openly told other diplomats about these secret dealings, closing their encirclement by ensuring that it would be revealed to the American public. For the government officials who had been involved in the affair, there was no possible escape route from the mess they had been drawn into. Feeling intense pressure from all sides as news of the deal became public, their attempts to cover it up or explain it away only made the situation worse. In luring your enemies into such a trap, always try to make them feel as if they are in control of the situation. They will advance as far as you want them to. Many of the Americans involved in Iran-Contra believed they were the ones conning the naive Iranians. Finally, do not simply work to envelop your opponent's forces or immediate emotions, but rather envelop their whole strategy, indeed their whole conceptual framework. This ultimate form of envelopment involves first studying the rigid, predictable parts of your opponent's strategy, then crafting a novel strategy of your own that goes outside their experience. Taking on the armies of Islam, Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the Teutonic Order, the Mongols did not merely defeat them, they annihilated them by inventing a new brand of mobile warfare to use against an enemy mired in centuries-old methods of fighting. This kind of strategic mismatch can lead to victory not just in any given battle, but in large-scale campaigns, the ultimate goal in any form of war. Reversal. The danger of envelopment is that unless it is completely successful, it may leave you in a vulnerable position. You have announced your plans. The enemy knows that you are trying to annihilate it, and unless you can quickly deliver your knockout punch, it will work furiously not only to defend itself, but to destroy you. For now, your destruction is its only safeguard. Some armies that have failed in their envelopments have found themselves later encircled by their enemies. Use this strategy only when you have a reasonable chance of bringing it to the conclusion you desire. Here are further reflections on the annihilation strategy. From The Anatomy of the Zulu Army by Ian Knight. Legend has it that Shaka altered the nature of fighting in the region forever by inventing a heavy, broad-bladed spear designed to withstand the stresses of close-quarter combat. Perhaps he did. Certainly both Zulu sources and the accounts of white travelers and officials in the 19th century credit him with this achievement. His military innovations made an impact on Zulu folklore, if nothing else, for Shaka certainly developed fighting techniques to an unprecedented degree, and there is a wealth of stories concerning his prowess as a warrior. He may indeed have been one of the great military geniuses of his age. In place of the loose skirmishing tactics with light throwing spears, Shaka trained his warriors to advance rapidly in tight formations and engage hand-to-hand, battering the enemy with larger war shields, then skewering their foes with the new spear as they were thrown off balance. If the results are anything to judge by, Shaka's capacity for conquest must have been dramatic. By 1824, the Zulus had eclipsed all their rivals and had extended their influence over an area many times larger than their original homeland. From The Anatomy of the Zulu Army by Ian Knight. The careful use by the Zulus of cover during their advance was observed time and again by the British. Another anonymous survivor of Isandlwana noted that as the Zulus crested the Nioni Ridge and came within sight of camp, they appeared almost to grow out of the earth. From rock and bush on the heights above started scores of men, some with rifles, others with shields and assegais. Lieutenant Edward Hutton of the 60th left a rather more complete description of the Zulu army deploying for the attack at Gingindlovu. The dark masses of men in open order and under admirable discipline followed each other in quick succession, running at a steady pace through the long grass. Having moved steadily round so as exactly to face our front, the larger portion of the Zulus broke into 3 lines, in knots and groups of 5 to 10 men, and advanced toward us. They continued to advance, still at a run, until they were about 800 yards from us, when they began to open fire. In spite of the excitement of the moment, we could not but admire the perfect manner in which these Zulus skirmished. A knot of 5 or 6 would rise and dart through the long grass, dodging from side to side with heads down, rifles and shields kept low and out of sight. They would then suddenly sink into the long grass, and nothing but puffs of curling smoke would show their whereabouts. Then they advance again. The speed of this final advance was terrifying. When the British gave the order to cease firing and fall back at Isandlwana, the Zulus were pinned down some 200 or 300 yards from the British position. Lieutenant Curling of the artillery noted that in the time it took for his experienced men to limber his guns, the Zulus had rushed in so quickly that one gunner had actually been stabbed as he mounted the axle-tree seat. A Zulu veteran of the battle, Umoti of the Ukandampenvu, thought the final charge so swift that like a flame the whole Zulu force sprang to its feet and darted upon them. From the History of Rome, by Livy. As soon as it grew light, Hannibal sent forward the Balearics and the other light infantry. He then crossed the river in person, and as each division was brought across, he assigned it its place in the line. The Gaulish and Spanish horse he posted near the bank on the left wing in front of the Roman cavalry. The right wing was assigned to the Numidian troopers. The center consisted of a strong force of infantry, the Gauls and Spaniards in the middle, the Africans at either end of them. These nations, more than any other, inspired terror by the vastness of their stature and their frightful appearance. The Gauls were naked above the waist. The Spaniards had taken up their position wearing white tunics embroidered with purple of dazzling brilliancy. The total number of infantry in the field at Cannae was 40,000, and there were 10,000 cavalry. Hasdrubal was in command of the left wing, Maharbal of the right. Hannibal himself, with his brother Mago, commanded the center. It was a great convenience to both armies that the sun shone obliquely on them, whether it was that they purposely so placed themselves, or whether it happened by accident, since the Romans faced the north, the Carthaginians the south. The wind, called by the inhabitants the Vulturnus, was against the Romans, and blew great clouds of dust into their faces, making it impossible for them to see in front of them. When the battle at Cannae was raised, the auxiliaries ran forward, and the battle began with the light infantry. Then the Gauls and Spaniards on the left engaged the Roman cavalry on the right. The battle was not at all like a cavalry fight, for there was no room for maneuvering. The river on the one side and the infantry on the other, hemming them in, compelled them to fight face to face. Each side tried to force their way straight forward, till at last the horses were standing in a closely pressed mass, and the riders seized their opponents and tried to drag them from their horses. It had become mainly a struggle of infantry, fierce but short, and the Roman cavalry was repulsed and fled. Just as this battle of the cavalry was finished, the infantry became engaged, and as long as the Gauls and Spaniards kept their ranks unbroken, both sides were equally matched in strength and courage. At length, after long and repeated efforts, the Romans closed up their ranks, echeloned their front, and by the sheer weight of their deep column, bore down the division of the enemy which was stationed in front of Hannibal's line, and was too thin and weak to resist the pressure. Without a moment's pause, they followed up their broken and hastily retreating foe till they took to headlong flight. Cutting their way through the mass of fugitives, who offered no resistance, they penetrated as far as the Africans who were stationed on both wings, somewhat further back than the Gauls and Spaniards, who had formed the advance center. As the latter fell back, the whole front became level, and as they continued to give ground, it became concave and crescent-shaped, the Africans at either end forming the horns. As the Romans rushed on incautiously between them, they were enfiladed by the two wings, which extended and closed round them in the rear. On this, the Romans, who had fought one battle to no purpose, left the Gauls and Spaniards, whose rear they had been slaughtering, and commenced a fresh struggle with the Africans. The contest was a very one-sided one, for not only were they hemmed in on all sides, but wearied with the previous fighting, they were meeting fresh and vigorous opponents. And lastly, from the wiles of war, 36 military strategies from ancient China. That night, Ren Fu stationed the Song army troops by the Haoshui River, while Zhu Guan and Wu Ying made camp on a tributary of the river. They were about 5 li apart. Scouts reported that the Xia forces were inferior in number and seemed rather fearful. At this, Ren Fu lost his vigilance and grew contemptuous of the men of Xia. He did not stop his officers and men from pursuing the Xia army and capturing its abandoned provisions. Geng Fu reminded him that the men of Xia had always been deceptive and advised him to bring the troops under discipline and advance slowly in a regular formation. Scouts should also be dispatched to probe further into the surrounding areas in order to find out what tricks the enemy was up to. However, Ren Fu ignored this advice. He made arrangements with Zhu Guan to proceed by separate routes to pursue the enemy and joined forces at the mouth of the Haoshui River the next day. The Xia horsemen feigned defeat, emerging now and then 4 or 5 li in front of the Song army. Ren Fu and Zhu Guan marched swiftly in a hot pursuit, eventually arriving to the north of the city of Lungan. There, the Xia soldiers suddenly vanished from sight. Ren Fu realized at last that he had been deceived and decided to pull the troops out of the mountainous region. The next day, Ren Fu led his men to move westward along the Haoshui River. They finally got out of the Liupan Mountains and proceeded toward the city of Yangmulung. At this juncture, Ren Fu got reports of enemy activity in the vicinity. He had to call the troops to a halt about 5 li from the city and array them in a defensive formation. Just then, several large wooden boxes were discovered lying by the road. The boxes were tightly sealed, and rustling sound came from within. Curiously, Ren Fu ordered the boxes to be opened. All of a sudden, dozens of pigeons fluttered out of the boxes and flew high into the sky with loud tinkling sounds coming from the small bells attached to their claws. All the Song soldiers looked up in astonishment when large hosts of Xia soldiers appeared in every direction to form a complete encirclement. On hearing the pigeon bells, Yuan Hao knew that the Song army had entered his ambush ring. Thereupon, he sent an assistant general with 50,000 men to surround and assault the band of troops led by Zhu Guan, and led the other half of his troops in person to attack Ren Fu, whom he considered a tougher opponent than Zhu Guan. The Song soldiers failed to penetrate the encirclement and were compelled to continue the tangled fight. Many were killed, and some even threw themselves down the precipice in despair. Ren Fu himself was hit by over a dozen arrows. One of his guards urged him to surrender, which seemed the only way to save his life and the remnants of his men. But Ren Fu sighed and said, "I am a general of the Song, and shall pay for this defeat with my life." With this, he brandished his mace and fought fiercely until he was mortally injured on the face by a spear. Then he took his own life by strangling himself. All of Renfu's subordinate officers died in combat, and his army was completely wiped out. Chapter 20. Maneuver them into weakness. The ripening for the sickle strategy. No matter how strong you are, fighting endless battles with people is exhausting, costly, and unimaginative. Wise strategists generally prefer the art of maneuver. Before the battle even begins, they find ways to put their opponents in positions of such weakness that victory is easy and quick. Bait enemies into taking positions that may seem alluring, but are actually traps and blind alleys. If their position is strong, get them to abandon it by leading them on a wild goose chase. Create dilemmas. Devise maneuvers that give them a choice of ways to respond, all of them bad. Channel chaos and disorder in their direction. Confused, frustrated, and angry opponents are like ripe fruit on the bough. The slightest breeze will make them fall. Maneuver warfare. Throughout history, two distinct styles of warfare can be identified. The most ancient is the war of attrition. The enemy surrenders because you have killed so many of its men. A general fighting a war of attrition will calculate ways to overwhelm the other side with larger numbers, or with the battle formation that will do the most damage, or with superior military technology. In any event, victory depends on wearing down the other side in battle. Even with today's extraordinary technology, attrition warfare is remarkably unsophisticated, playing into humanity's most violent instincts. Over many centuries, and most notably in ancient China, a second method of waging war developed. The emphasis here was not destroying the other side in battle, but weakening and unbalancing it before the battle began. The leader would maneuver to confuse and infuriate, and to put the enemy in a bad position, having to fight uphill, or with the sun or wind in its face, or in a cramped space. In this kind of war, an army with mobility could be more effective than one with muscle. The maneuver warfare philosophy was codified by Sun Tzu in his Art of War, written in China's Warring States period in the 5th to 3rd century BC. Over 200 years of escalating cycles of warfare in which a state's very survival depended on its army and strategists. To Sun Tzu and his contemporaries, it was obvious that the costs of war went far beyond its body counts. It entailed a loss of resources and political goodwill, and a lowering of morale among soldiers and citizens. These costs would mount over time, until eventually even the greatest warrior nation would succumb to exhaustion. But through adroit maneuvering, a state could spare itself such high costs and still emerge victorious. An enemy who had been maneuvered into a weak position would succumb more easily to psychological pressure. Even before the battle had begun, it had imperceptibly started to collapse and would surrender with less of a fight. Several strategists outside Asia, most notably Napoleon Bonaparte, have made brilliant use of maneuver warfare. But in general, attrition warfare is deeply ingrained in the Western way of thinking, from the ancient Greeks to modern America. In an attrition culture, thoughts naturally gravitate toward how to overpower problems, obstacles, those who resist us. In the media, emphasis is placed on big battles, whether in politics or in the arts. Static situations in which there are winners and losers. People are drawn to the emotional and dramatic quality in any confrontation, not the many steps that lead to such confrontation. The stories that are told in such cultures are all geared toward such battle-like moments, a moral message preached through the ending, as opposed to the more telling details. On top of it all, this way of fighting is deemed more manly, honorable, honest. More than anything, maneuver war is a different way of thinking. What matters here is process, the steps toward battle, and how to manipulate them to make the confrontation less costly and violent. In the maneuver universe, nothing is static. Battles are, in fact, dramatic illusions, short moments in the larger flow of events, which is fluid, dynamic, and susceptible to alteration through careful strategy. This way of thinking finds no honor or morality in wasting time, energy, and lives in battle. Instead, wars of attrition are seen as lazy, reflecting the primitive human tendency to fight back reactively without thinking. In a society full of attrition fighters, you will gain an instant advantage by converting to maneuver. Your thought process will become more fluid, more on the side of life, and you will be able to thrive off the rigid, battle-obsessed tendencies of the people around you. By always thinking first about the overall situation and about how to maneuver people into positions of weakness rather than fight them, you will make your battles less bloody, which, since life is long and conflict is endless, is wise if you want a fruitful and enduring career. And a war of maneuver is just as decisive as a war of attrition. Think of weakening your enemies as ripening them like grain, ready to be cut down at the right moment. The following are the 4 main principles of maneuver warfare. Craft a plan with branches. Maneuver warfare depends on planning, and the plan has to be right. Too rigid, and you leave yourself no room to adjust to the inevitable chaos and friction of war. Too loose, and unforeseen events will confuse and overwhelm you. The perfect plan stems from a detailed analysis of the situation, which allows you to decide on the best direction to follow, or the perfect position to occupy, and suggests several effective options, branches, to take.